Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of the Livenza River fought in 776 between the Carolingians and the Longobards of Austria, that is essentially northeastern Italy. That constitutes a true Longobard last stand as far as the Langobardia Mire was concerned. And that has a bit of a mysterious outcome. Right, overall, because these sources are fundamentally disagreeing, at least in part, as we will see now, on the outcome of this clash that could even constitute, if not probably a Longobard victory over Charlemagne himself, still such a fierce fight to bring the Frankish king to negotiate a relatively advantageous peace for the local Longobard nobility. So the background is definitely fascinating, right? In 773, at the battle fought at the Locks of St. Michael in the Susa Valley, on the left bank of the Dora Riparia River, you have the major Longobard defeat that would bring, especially after the fall of Pavia, in the following year, to the Carolingian conquest of the Longobard kingdom. This had not been the first battle between the two peoples that had quite a rivalry, especially in Merovingian times at the end of the 6th, beginning of the 7th century, where in fact the Franks had invaded Italy together with the Byzantines, specifically the Po Valley, right, trying to dislodge the Longobards after the migration in the peninsula. Pepin the Short had already moved into Italy, defeating the Longobard king Aistulf a couple of times, and essentially opening the way to the eventual conquest by showing that this people was essentially to give way on the longer run to the recompacted Frankish power that had occurred because of the Pepinids Arnold things. However, this clash wouldn't be the last, right? Charlemagne had his own, let's say, business at home that prevented him to intervene in Italy at different times, especially as long as his brother Charlemagne was alive, and this was a bit always the problem of the Franks, that they split continuously their kingdom because they essentially deemed it a merely dynastic, private, personal possession. The general outlook, let's say, of the relations between the Carolingians and the Longobards is definitely fascinating, because in spite of these attritions, before the papal call of Pippin the Short, right, this had occurred before at the time of Charles Martel, but the Franks at that point were coping with the Arabs that were involved elsewhere, and they were in fact allied with the Longobards that were called, right, for their king Liutprand, in fact, to send troops against the Saracens in Provence, and more. But the general picture actually is the one of friendship, right? The Franks and the Longobards, aside from again this incidents that have to do with the very beginning. This is always the same, right? The cliches about the Longobards in pop culture pertain specifically and exclusively to the very beginning of their history and the very end of their history. Like everything that happened in between that is clamorously important is always neglected, simply because nobody simply teaches these things or cares about them, whatever. But the broader outlook is the one of friendship between the two people, for a number of reasons. Indeed, because of course the Franks at a point were fragmented. The Longobards by the end of the 7th century were even a more unitary power than the Franks. That indeed, and I made multiple videos about this, once recompacted, had the obvious aim of entering the Mediterranean, and obviously enough, Italy, right? I made videos on how, for example, the Justinian Reconquest was substantially aiming at also establishing a bulwark against Merovingian Gaul, and preventing what eventually mostly the crisis of the second half of the 6th century with the pandemic and the general collapse of civilization brought all over Eurasia. For this power, however, both powers, both the Franks and the Byzantines, to reactivate their ambitions towards this time. And the Franks, of course, would always invade Italy. This is just a longer continuum in the history between France and Italy. Every time France becomes compact as a unitary realm after substantial turbulences that affect them, like depending on the 100 Years' War, the confessional clashes, etc., would always preferably take the way of Italy. And here the pattern is already there. By the way, in these wars, today's borders between France and Italy are properly marked. Normally, two countries border on the base of the watershed, right? The Alps instead are controlled in their peaks by the French. And this, at least if you look at the Susa Valley, it was the main entrance by the French, and Italy begins basically just as the almost at the flatland, right? Because the Franks had the upper hand. They were a larger, more warlike, and more properly imperial people, right, per se. They had developed this. I made, again, countless videos about the Franks, their military organization, both the Carolingian, the Merovingian one. And you know that, especially at this point, the Pipinids, Arnulfings had been further ingraining and boosting and consolidating the essentially establishment of professional military clienteles that were, as such, right, in that scale, that level of collective training, of cohesion, of especially yearly campaigns, right, that were launched continuously, so that these people literally did only that, right? When they every spring, every summer, they invaded some other country, making also the Carolingian Empire as we know it. Other peoples in Europe did not have this, right? The Anglo-Saxons, the Longobards, whichever Latin Germanic people at the time fundamentally relied on, yes, of course, a core of de facto professional troops in the form of bodyguards, of some kind of elite, etc. But then, and I made a video about the Longobard army as well, it was just a normal segmentation of classes corresponding to personal wealth status. This was true for the Franks as well, and actually arms and armor among these people didn't differ that much. After the Longobards converted fully to Christianity, they stopped, unfortunately, from an archaeological point of view, to bury their dead in arms, their warriors in arms. So we are deprived of, say, for the latter part of the kingdom's history, a great part of their apological phase, fundamentally. But from the few, of course, evidence that we can gather, we notice, of course, that technologism does not exist. These peoples had the same identical type of weapons, of armor, and so on. The difference was made, of course, by their political and social systems that were consistently different. And again, today I cannot make the entire explanation because we have to talk about else, but I have a pretty hefty Frankish history playlist that, as you know, explains pretty much everything, right? The enormous wealth concentration in the hands of very few people in Gaul is incomparable with Italy, where wealth was much more widespread, let's say, individually. And so that even a small Carolingian magnate was often owning more land than the same Longobard king, and consequently the military clientele could be formed. So this continuous lifetime training, because they literally the Franks did only one thing: they fought. Like literally, there's not even a single thing in the mindset of a Frank beyond war. It does not exist. It's unconceivable. That's the only thing they do, and as a consequence, they do it better than anybody else. So this is, at least in a very condensed fashion, the reason why at least the Carolingians scored such impressive success. There is also another aspect about this, though, historically speaking, that you will understand why I make a premise about now. That is that we cannot, unfortunately, document practically anything from a tactical point of view of these battles, notoriously. The only Carolingian battle that can be tactically reconstructed is the one of Zuntal against the Saxons, also one of the few Carolingian defeats, simply because the accounts there give us a sensible idea of the places, the times, the forces involved. In the Frankish annals, in the other sources, but also, say, the entire Carolingian era, that is basically all about war, just tells us, these guys met on that field that day, and God decided in favor of this one. Point. End of the story. Even people who actually fought there, there is, for example, Charlemagne's nephew, or grandson actually, Bernard, was also, that participated at the Battle of Fontenoy, was killed in an ambush in Aquitaine against the Vikings. He wrote as well because he was an abbot. And as you know, the Carolingian abbots, bishops, were militarized consistently. He writes the story, but he doesn't care about explaining what happened on the battlefield, the largest, bloodiest battle in Carolingian history. We have, for example, an Italian clerk from Ravenna that actually gives it, that was definitely no man of war, but that gives us more information, military, tactical information about the battle, that is still, however, pretty generic, perfectly in line with the historiography of the time, for us to see at least a bit more in depth of that. And this alone speaks volumes about the same Carolingian military. I mean, it's better to know, to have a paradox like this than actually having some extra detail, because the mere fact that to these people was completely normal to fight, to have wars, and not finding, of course, any reason to describe them further for a practical sense, because they were so abysmal, and so basically all what the empire was about was that there was no point of explaining it further to someone. Nor was no particular, interest for further elaboration. Again, these men were just military men as such, and they were satisfied enough of their own accomplishment just in life, and wouldn't think the world probably would change that much in time, and probably thought that the past had been pretty much the same, reading their accounts about the Romans, about Alexander, and so on. So the Battle of the Livenza River, as we will see now, suffers of the same problem of documentation, because we do not know what happened in it. Just we have the sources telling something different from one another about the outcome. Now, the Carolingians crushed the Longobards at the locks of St. Michael in the Susa Valley in this incredible feat of, that tells you the traumatic scale of development of Carolingian logistics, right? You cannot say that Charlemagne was a military genius in absolute terms, also because the armies of that time wouldn't, and also the documentation wouldn't allow us to actually elaborate in dramatically refined fashion on strategy and tactics, but the sheer personal energy of the sovereign and the massive organizational capacity crowned by the actual military accomplishments is something unspeakable, right? I will make a video about Carolingian logistics because it's something that blows your mind entirely. And definitely what had happened in 773 was definitely at least one of the major feats Carolingian logistics and, generally speaking, military operations. Just maybe the amphibious operations against the other Khaganate along the Danube can't compare. But just tell you this: the Longobards were blocking the passes, right, at the Alpine foothills, and it was incredibly risky just to bottle up the entire Frankish army in just one of these valleys. So the army were enormous, right? So there were enormous, not just logistical problems, but literally matters of bare hygiene, of just like you had to move fast, you had to make things work well, and squeezing these masses into the Alpine passes, and especially finding some fortified locks presided over by the Longobard army was a great risk. So what Charlemagne does is that he splits the Carolingian forces in two. One he entrusts to his uncle Bernard, that is to cross, in fact, at the Grand St. Bernard's Pass, and he crossed instead at the Mont Cenis. Because they wouldn't know where the Longobards... It was still a huge gamble, right? This was no genius move. The problem, again, was having the actual force and organizational capacity to be able to afford to carry out such an operation, which required enormous coordination, intelligence, contacts. Again, this speaks volumes about the advancement of the Frankish army. They could find the Longobards moving in internal lines, having still an advantage with that, but apparently the thing was not needed. The Longobards, as we were saying before, had already been crushed at the locks decades before, and at that point the Carolingians had been able to overrun these fortifications, and it had been a disaster for the Longobards. That up to that point, just like, I don't know, think about the Italian wars, right, before Fort Novo, the expedition of Charles VIII, nobody really knew, because nobody had really ever done, right, something like a major scale invasion, like of the Italian peninsula, to seize it over entirely. There had been, of course, naturally some expeditions before, but at that point you could also count on some internal fronts that would simply support you, etc. So it's very different. This was equal. Like in early medieval warfare, you do not find operations of this scale, and they are, again, a huge gamble just per se. However, at this point, the Longobards had surely learned from the previous times, and the locks constituted an impressive defense system, right? They were essentially a system of various castles, fortifications scattered across the valleys, with various ditches, palisades, towers, things like that. And of course, their main deal was to assist the defense of an army. Just every fortification per se does not have any strategic value. You have to man it, you have to garrison it, defend it in some way. And the Carolingians in 773, so the chunk of Charlemagne himself, arrived in front of the locks. They found them barred by the Longobard army, and we do not actually know what happened, again, lacking documentation. But it seems that the Franks found a path on the Longobard flanks. They managed to bypass the locks in some way. Again, we do not know how, but just think about the Thermopylae or things like that. And they overrun the Longobard royal army, right? They swarmed then in the Po Valley, besieging Pavia. It was the Longobard capital. And here you have yet another feat of Carolingian logistics, to say the least, because the heavily fortified Romano-Germanic cities of Longobard Italy are a massive bulwark, right? There is not really a thing like that north of the Alps. And in fact, the siege of Pavia lasts 9 months, the longest siege in the entire Carolingian military history. The Longobards hold right? This had been their strategy, actually, at the time of the Frankish-Byzantine invasion back in the previous century. They had locked themselves inside the multitude of Roman cities that they occupied. A plague broke out in the enemy armies, both the Frankish and Byzantines, that couldn't quite coordinate with one another in the theater, and this invasion failed, and the Longobards basically managed to consolidate their kingdom up to that point. Right. In 774, however, Pavia surrenders. Right. The Frankish army occupies the Longobard kingdom. That is quite composite politically, geographically. So the Franks at this point are pushing fundamentally towards into a southern frontier that, as I explained also in a video about the Carolingian domination of Italy, that specifically touched on political and strategic issues, was say again, to be treated with caution for many reasons. First of all, the country was just newly conquered, and it was a civilized one, urbanized, literate, actually pretty unitary, independently from what people normally think about the Longobards. The local sovereigns had managed to have at least a direct control of the entire western central Po Valley, parts of Tuscany, Liguria, and so on, and also the other duchies were fundamentally aligned with the other kings. Right, there was since the late 6th century, no single Longobard duchy who said, no, we do not recognize the Longobard crown, or we want to secede from it, or we're going to destroy the kingdom, or we do not respond to the king in Pavia. At best, there were some conflicts, attritions for becoming kings themselves in Pavia from wherever they came, including the far south, like Benevent. And it was actually a pretty homogeneous profile that had been developing politically, institutionally, culturally, ethnically in this country. The country was rich and divided. That's the reason why, of course, as always, Italy was invaded historically for the sake of permanent conquest. And that, however, had its own, in fact, very peculiar mechanisms that made the Franks aware that they had to. It was in a sense easier, of course, than taming Saxony, where you had literally to build everything from scratch. But you also had to be cool enough with local nobility that you had to co-opt rather than to oppress, right, or humiliate, right. Now the problem is that before the Carolingian conquest, the other Frankish invasions in the last generation or so had shattered the realm politically, right? That's the only time in which you can say, well, there was one chunk of the kingdom was irresponsive. Again, I will not digress today. I have plenty of Longobard history videos in the relative playlist to explain again why the Longobard kingdom was actually compact, right? But just know that again, if you pick just the very beginning and the very end of Longobard history, which is usually what people do because they studied either in function of Romanity, the Gothic Wars, so the end of antiquity, all this stuff, or the Carolingian conquest, they see only that, right? But find one person that is actually competent in Longobard politics or institutions or law or administration or whatever, right? I hope, of course, to cover some gaps on YouTube, also because there is literally nothing about such things in depth. But you understand that being invaded twice, right, with a King Heistulf, that, by the way, manages to survive both times, and not because he was pretty brave, and he demonstrated that on other military occasions, but eventually trying and failing. And so you understand that our army is done for. The word Longobards at this point were literally migrating to Francia, where they were, I mean, we're talking about nobility, right, with all their possessions and so on, because they somehow foresaw what would have happened, right? So political, like with the conquest, upheaval, general impoverishment, and so they wanted to avoid that. And that's the context that is really exacerbated by this defeat that must be remembered is not the defeat of the entire Longobard army at the locks of the Susa Valley, but the one of the Longobard king Desiderius, that, however, had not been recognized, the only one in this sense since the late 6th century, as king by all the Longobards, and the reason being that this guy had de facto bought his crown from the Franks and the Pope, right? After the expeditions of Pippin the Short, the death of Heistulf, his brother Rathkes, that had constituted, in fact, this Friulan. I made a video about medieval Friuli, by the way, and you understand also why this is important here. And can't say dynasty, but at least royal subsequence, which also shows you how allegedly the most peripheral dukes were functionally and peacefully elected by the Longobard establishment to successfully rule in the country that the Longobards had carried out at this point, basically the gradual conquest of almost the entire Italian peninsula, and extended their territories also on the ones of the former Exarchate. Were about to seize Rome, where there was a pro-Longobard faction, as well in the papal milieu, or those who could become popes themselves. So this background, again, I would like to digress on it, but you shouldn't have missed it. But it's very important not to fall into cliches and other stuff. And only at this point, the feeling that such appointment to the Longobard throne had been essentially carried out by some foreign power had discontented the Longobard traditionalists, right, and the Longobard system a bit as a whole, because Desiderius was not really like a bad king in a broader political, administrative sense, but of course had, in a way, betrayed what had been, and we were talking about it just the other day, the sense of political, national, and ethnic identity of the Longobard people that had never compromised with anyone. Recognized essentially its own valor in the sense of the people in arms, and so somebody would not be elected as by the assembly of the freemen, with the nobility at this point, on a national base, was seen as a non-ruler, right? And this distance that some Longobard dukes had taken at this point from Desiderius was relevant. Now, when Pavia was overrun, the Franks proceeded to occupy the country. Here, the migration era is over, so it's not like, in fact, in Longobard times where you have hundreds of thousands of people moving en masse. No, the Franks here are a very specific Gallo-Roman, in fact, Germanic system. They are an empire. They are essentially a people that rules over a set of other peoples. As you know, and I always say, the Longobards were the only one of the Carolingian subjects to be put at the same level of the Franks, right? Charlemagne seizes the crown of the Franks as much as the one of the Longobards, right? And he will change the name of the country, namely from Regnum Langobardorum to Regnum Italicum, Regnum Italiae, to dilute a bit the sense, in fact, of local national pride, because now it was the Franks who ruled over, again, a Longobard people, admittedly, because of the great respect that this, in fact, truly Germanic Longobard tradition that had never compromised with some kind of role within the empire, at least in an ethnic sense, to the point of saying, well, we are, I don't know, Roman vicars or something like the Franks had done instead since the beginning, had somehow stood out, right? The legions of Alboin were sung in Northern Europe. Still, Snorri Sturluson talks about the great deed of this Longobard leader. I mean, there was a sense of a recognition of this connection. The Longobard princes were sent to be cut ritually their hair, in passage into manhood at the Carolingian courts. There were strong ties with the Anglo-Saxons, by the way, because the Longobards had migrated just from the areas of Lower Saxony, were eventually occupied by the Saxons, some of which moved eventually to Britain. So that they were close, they were similar. There were some Saxons at the time of the Longobard migration that arrived into Italy and eventually came back. Similar things. So there was even a sense of military, say, primacy, right? As far especially as that sense of equestrian capacity was traditionally attributed to peoples like the Visigoths, now conquered by the Arabs, and the Longobards from the same Franks, right? This is interesting because the Franks remembered that back in the day, the most equestrian-versed peoples among the Germans were indeed the peoples like the Goths and the Longobards, so that individually there were still games played by the Longobards that are reminiscent of the later, I don't know, even communal ones you find with tournaments, like you name them, that were deeply connected still even with pagan symbolism, etc. While the Franks were, at this point, actually way more advanced in cavalry warfare than basically, again, any other people in Western Europe, but still tributed to the Longobards that had relatively, again, gentrified, civilized. The Longobard dukes lived in the cities. They were literate. They administrated, did justice, they had changed, right? There was a military ethos, right? The myth, again, of the weak Lombard that is just a merchant and the enemy of Charlemagne, etc., was not really the thing that's all an idea developed further, not much even from the same Middle Ages, but even from anti-papistic, kind of Southern European bias, etc., in modern contemporary era and so on. And at the time, things were very different and were recognized as such. Admittedly, the Franks were stronger than the Longobards, as the events of 773, 74, and also the ones before clearly show. But the two peoples respected each other enough also to make things work very smoothly, right? Today we talk exactly about that battle that proves that things were not hadn't gone so smoothly as at least Charlemagne would hope, but the general cooperation existed as far as, especially Charlemagne, as we will see now, was extremely careful about Italy. He sent the very best of the Carolingian nobility from northeastern France, bigger place like that. They would, in fact, make up also the Italic nobility in later times, because he needed trustees locally, right? He realized that this was no periphery in a primary sense, right? It was periphery from a geographical point of view, but this was the source of Roman civilization, of the papal imperial appointment legacy. The Italic kingdom will be, as I also often remind, the only one who could confer the Holy Roman imperial title. Later on, we'll see now also Paul the Deacon, like great intellectuals that worked at the court of Charlemagne, that were close to the same nobility that would actually think of rebellion and would actually rebel, right? As we will see now, Paul the Deacon's brother participated, was captured at the Battle of the Livenza River. So you understand the closeness of these worlds, but also the obvious difference between the same. The Franks, as we were saying before, weren't moving as a people. Now they weren't expanding in a demographic sense. They were just militarily, imperially occupying a conquered country, which is a different thing, which means that they were injecting some contained but still pretty tough armed nuclei in all the neurologic centers of the Longobard kingdom, right? From the most important cities that were definitely the heart of the kingdom to the most important river passages, such as the one, as we will see now, of the Livenza. Patrolling the roads of greater communication, the most densely populated areas, and thus needing a more strict and constant control, right? In practice, the Carolingian policy tended in all the conquered territories to substitute the local ruling class, in a sense, that had evidently been defeated in open field through the installation of some Carolingian lords in the greatest centers of power. But it doesn't happen so forcefully, right? And there is also a reason. The Longobard dukes, just like their kings, are elected normally. So there was not really a formalized, at least, dynastic succession. They could just wait, like with bishops, right? And that was the great advantage of centralizing through them, that they would die. And so you could simply make pressure to appoint a guy that is not even maybe yours, but just one that supports your cause or stuff like that, right? So this has, we will see it in other videos, it has different outcomes in the peninsula overall. The Carolingians would have problems on the longer run with privatization, decentralization. So definitely the Franks were injecting in Italy what would become later feudal culture, which up to this point had not existed. Really, these leaders had more land that the previous dukes had just had, because of course this was a land of conquest. So at least there was enough to collect from this land to endow with unprecedented power the new ruling class, compared at least to what the Longobards had been habituated. The system had been shattered. There is, generally speaking, a worsening of the average life quality in Italy. Obviously, after the Frankish invasion, it's not a disaster. Actually, the Carolingian kingdom of Italy would go on even through up to the late 9th century with some significant functionality also of the previous Longobard system, like the one of the exercitus, etc., because this is what also appears from the Carolingian capitularies at this point. Something that always struck me when I read it is to say, when they issued these laws, these were provisional in nature. Like the Longobards had their own code. The Carolingians arrived, they installed in their in the palaces, in the wherever it is. The laws had been previously issued, and they said, look, it's evident. They were saying, let's cooperate. They said, show us, right, because we are new here. We do not know how it works, how you were governed before we arrived. This is literally what they asked the locals, right? And they began to cooperate in that sense. Naturally, their first concern was maintaining the bridges. That's crucial. The roads, the patrol, like they cared enormously about the infrastructural connect net of the country, because again, the entire Carolingian domination worked on its own logistics, on its own communicate. These were very well infrastructurally served areas, nothing like in the north. So that was even more important to control, because things could go smoother if you controlled everything, but if somebody rebelled, things could become significantly more complicated fast, right? So in some Longobard lands, the local rulers had fundamentally given way to the Carolingians without too much problem, right? We've seen recently the Duchy of Spoleto, how the thing happened. In that case, they actually cut their hair from the Longobard way to the Roman one, and they entrusted themselves to the papacy, right? That was allied with the Franks and now was managing also lots of things in Italy accordingly. Other dukes were left by the Franks where they were, but let's say were just either swearing an oath of fealty to the new rulers, new king of the Longobards, right? So everybody essentially behaved in a relatively functional way, and there wasn't much bloodshed in the first place, right? This is not witnessed. There are surely some Longobards that flee the north, they take refuge in the south. I made a video about the Longobardia Minor. In all this, there were the Byzantines that were not happy at all that the popes and the Franks had been sharing Italy for themselves, and now we're trying to make a comeback from the south. But the general profile of the Italic kingdom was peaceful, right? There wasn't any, aside from the initial war and etc., it was not a radical or brutal subject, nothing like what would happen, I don't know, in Saxony, for example. That was a completely different story. And could have not been otherwise, because there was only that way to conquer the land in the first place. Here, things worked really differently. There was, however, one area of Italy that had not digested what had happened, right? And it was the so-called Austria, that is to say, the northeast. Just like the Frankish kingdom, the Longobard one was divided in a western and in an eastern part. Respectively, in Francia, Neustria and Austrasia, in Italy, Neustria and Austria. The latter not having to do actually with the modern country of Austria in spite of the geographical proximity. Just, you understand it, it's within the Po Valley. You have Pavia, which is with Milan, with the most Roman cities of the Longobards, where they installed their own capital and so on. Neustria, right, the side bordering with the Franks as well, with the Alps in the west. Then in the northeast of Italy, you have the Longobard Austria, which is made up of a bunch of duchies that have a very specific character on their own, or at least that stand out for the most, let's say, historically and representatively hardcore of the Longobard spirit, pride, and even warlikeness to a degree. You see, the modern region of Lombardy takes name after the Longobards, because mostly their capital was there. The kingdom of Longobardia would remain as such, right, intended, like mostly gravitating around Lombardy. But the greatest concentration, also from a genetic point of view of the early migrations, etc., the place where the greatest impact would be made by Longobards culturally, ethnically, and more, was the northeast, right? That was a less urbanized, less populated area, but still, importantly so for European standards at the time. As you understand, there were cities, like it was like the other, just less than, say, Lombardy or Tuscany. Again, I made a video about medieval Friuli that explains that, and which had maintained just also sort of strategic relevance in the wars against the Avars and the Slavs that at times came to harass the Friulan plain, and that these Austrians basically had to defend with, also pretty bloodily from both sides. There is all a military history about this. The aforementioned Heistulf and Ratges had been dukes of Friuli. It was the most important duchy in the area, with the capital of Cividale. That was Forum Iuli, founded by Caesar back in the day. This was the city where Alboin had essentially left his horse marshal, right, Marfaes, while he was just proceeding unopposed in the Po Valley to guard the rear of the Longobard migration, right, from possible attacks as a reserve and so on. The Austrians had been the last ones to abandon Arianism, right? It's not that there had been any particular problem in Italy, as also we countlessly explained. Like, you do not find what occurred in Vandal Africa or in Visigothic Spain, where the Arians and the Catholics basically destroyed their own realm, or at least undermined it significantly. There was a political playing with this kind of factionalism based on the various beliefs, but this wouldn't give rise to any persecution, bloodshed, concern, whatever. Mostly these parties were based, like this is true also among the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, and the Visigoths, on mostly the type of attitude that at a point they should have had with, especially the locals, right, with the Romans in times, however, and kingdoms like those ones, including the same Italy in Theodoric's times, where the Roman administration was still intact, right, and was in a sense hoping to come back within, say, a direct Roman rule, hence the Justinian and Reconquest and so on. After the Gothic War, Italy is a completely different place, and in fact the Longobards assimilate that strongly and even culturally Germanize the Italians, basically, exactly because those social divides between the great latifundia owners and the colonists had been destroyed by the same destruction of this latifundium system. And so basically the Romans joined the sense of a Longobard individual freedom, like actually the Romans had been having, like in the past, and so there was a great continuity in the cities, also in the country, with a sense of traditional Romano-Germanic liberty that in fact would be greater in Italy throughout the Middle Ages than basically in any other place in Europe, differently from actually the places of origins of the same Germans that, as it was exactly happening in Carolingian times, were going under the elites to a degree which didn't contemplate practically any personal freedom, right? So sort of switching of the roles. But speaking of Austria per se, the idea that these peoples had just been actually playing fair, right? They had recognized the monarchy, they had recognized Catholicism, they had essentially had the same strategic interests of Pavia, because protecting the eastern border of the kingdom was just everybody's winning, right? So had never really brought to any kind of secessionistic idea or sort of revanchism against the crown. On the contrary, the Longobards were quite, the Austrian Longobards were quite faithful to the crown. They would be able to say no to the crown at some point without the same Heistulf becoming king later, had been one that had basically escaped in front of the king, of Liutprand at the time, because he rejected like an imprisonment, and this thing was just in the Longobard traditional spirit felt to be a great deal. The same Liutprand was so impressed that he actually entrusted to man of honor the rear guard of the royal army in an expedition against Spoleto, that as we've seen, and Heistulf and Ratges succeeded in fencing off an ambush of this Spoletan rebels, and the Byzantines joined, and eventually they would become kings themselves. So those were the Longobards, right? They were not like the Merovingians that would basically break the head of newborn babies on a rock just because they were the blood of their brothers that had to succeed to the throne or whatever. No, everything was functional in a substantially civilized and definitely much more advanced system compared to the Franks, right? What had happened with Desiderius, though, was different, because, as I said before, these Austrians began to feel that the defeat of the royal army at the locks of St. Michael had not been a defeat of the entire Longobard people. They thought it had been a defeat of Desiderius and those Longobards that had followed him, but they had not participated themselves to that expedition in sign of protest, and they legitimately felt to have been undefeated by the Franks up to that point. And this was definitely a breaking one, given that you had Italy overrun by the Franks, and you had fundamentally behaved in this initial phase, but you were thinking how to pick up arms and making your stand against a foreign invader, and proving whether you were better or worse than him, right? You had other episodes in Austrian history, which the local dukes had taken up arms even against the same king. But it's important to stress here the individual, not the crown as such. For example, at the end of the 7th century, we have the rebellion of Alahis, that was the Duke of Trent, that with the support of the cities of Treviso and Vicenza, so the dukes that ruled them, promoted a true war, a true personal war against the king Conipert that was considered inadequate. And after the defeat, in fact, of this ruler, also against his successor Perctarit, right? And in this rebellion had actually the purpose of bringing Alahis to the throne himself again. So there was nothing separatistic or secessionistic about this thing. He just wanted to go to Pavia and to rule the entire kingdom, as any Longobard would have at that point recognized who was the stronger guy, and so the kingdom would have remained under his control. At this point, Alahis was still supporting the last Arian opposition, but as we were saying before, there were more concrete problems that now we don't have the time to digress on, regarding the various rivalries between the dukes themselves, personally, other issues were going on with royal policy. In any case, Alahis was defeated and killed at the Battle of Coronata on the Adda River, where Perctarit crushed the rebels, right? And the thing didn't have basically any following, right? It's not that, the East was humiliated, destroyed, or a foreign counter, whatever. No, the thing continued. They had other dukes, and they kept cooperating with the monarchy, as we were noticing just before. The sense that there had also been a last, say, Veneto-Friulan nobility ruling the kingdom, with the rise to the throne of Ratges in 744 and Aistulf in 756, surely had conferred the locals with a sense of themselves, right? The idea that after them there had just been Desiderius, that was a guy from Brescia that had been also, that is in Lombardy, but he had been Duke of Tuscia, and so representing a bit, again, that Neustrian kind of guy, which was also, say, relatively more gentrified, or at least, just projecting the kingdom towards a different stage of its history. This was felt as a sort of betrayal, again, by the Austrian nobility that wouldn't accept this king, nor the fact that they would have been defeated together with him, where they, first of all, had not sided with him in the first place, but also had not been personally crushed by the Franks. Naturally, the picture was beyond provincial because after the Longobard conquest of Italy, everything had changed in the central Mediterranean, for like in Europe, in like the entire system here that involved the Byzantines, other peoples around. So this was a fresh conquest, and the country, as we just observed, was just run by some previous discontent, this conflictuality between the Neustrians and the Austrians, the sense that a part of the realm had not been tamed yet, and that there could always be somebody from the outside, namely Constantinople, backing a rebellion against the Franks. Much had also to do with papal policy and the sense that, of course, the Roman factions in the urbs were always, seeking some kind of personal prestige. They were coming ever more prepotently at the center of imperial policy throughout the establishment of that, at least one that would occur a couple of decades later with the crowning of Charlemagne as Roman emperor by their own acclamation, as the imperial crowning formula actually took place in front of the Roman people, say the nobility in practice. So it was all in theory. In many ways, the Carolingian Empire was at the peak of its own, activity. They were taking on different countries at a time. The same Saxony. They were quite demanding fronts that required constant attention from the side of Charlemagne. So even some international rebellion could be triggered, right? What the Franks feared the most was one, let's say, more regions rebelling in the same season, so that they couldn't send, if not with difficulty, multiple armies, right? And also straining the Frankish resources were abundant, right, because of the vast Atlantic plains from the Pyrenees to the Jutland, the rich agricultural and abundant demographic resources. But we're still talking about the end of the 8th century, right? Everything was much more framed, regimented within some very specific cyclical, resources availability. And you had to prove again that you were the strongest in this sense in arms, right? And great part of the imperial deal was about this, having the deterrent capacity to not even send an army out there, but just letting the subjects know that this was always possible, right? And again, there was an incredible system behind it. The entire organization, stationed scattered everywhere, like these armies of tens of thousands of troops with a substantial core of, again, professional, heavily armored cavalry. It was extremely costly. It could cross thousands of kilometers back and forth in Europe. It is something incredible and exceptional and extraordinary that the Carolingians now are able to do. So the Austrians thought that to be at that point the if not the only, but definitely the most deserving heirs of the Longobard national pride and identity. Right, the southern Longobards had admittedly not been conquered by Charlemagne. It would attempt that at some point, but it would always remain in their southern Italian mountains, but too sheltered to be effectively conquered, and they could more sneakily played with the Byzantines in that regard. So they will always, until Norman times, play quite an interesting role. But now it was the northeast. It was the space which historically had been connected with the same Bavaria, that, as you know, it was a sort of Frankish offspring back in Merovingian times, that, however, with the decline of that dynasty, began to move away. It had entered actually the orbit of the Longobard kingdom, because the Longobards, it's a bit like the Franks, right? The Longobards with the Bavarians actually controlled the the valleys down from the Danubian watershed. So they were stronger, the Bavarians, and had basically started to hegemonize politics. There were even Bavarian kings at a point, installed by the Longobard nobility to rule the country and so on. So that world too was hoping to escape Charlemagne. At that point, you have Tassilo, who was the king's cousin, but tried his best to escape that pressure. The Avars were still where they were, so the sense there was some room regionally for at least standing one's ground and see what happened was that really titillated the Austrian kind of heroic fantasies and stuff like that. So among the principal promoters of this spirit of revanche, we can say, and not of defeat recognition, stood out Rothkauses, that was the Duke of Friuli, who, exploiting the still, partial functioning of essentially of a Longobard establishment in the peninsula, entertained some relation with all a series of, in fact, Longobard dukes with the purpose of establishing an organized resistance front to Charlemagne. So the objective of Rothkauses was the one of causing a general uprising to which should have participated, besides the dukes of the Veneto area in the northeast, also Hildebrand, Duke of Spoleto, some dukes of Tuscia, this Tuscany, such as Reginbald of Chiusi, and also Arichis II of Benevent, so the southern Longobard landmass. To the plot, finally, the Byzantines should have added something, right? As we were saying before, Constantinople was quite upset that the Carolingians had taken over de facto Rome at that point, and I made a video about this. I don't remember which one about the Carolingians, but in which there is famously enough a Byzantine source at the time saying, but that this is the moment basically in which we lost Rome, really, not before, historically. But the complex organization of the system failed, right? For a number of reasons, politically, but also in terms of strategic feasibility. First of all, you have the intervention of Pope Hadrian I, that, having been alerted of this plot, informed quickly Charlemagne about this. So, of course, the Carolingians knew that. I mean, generally speaking, they were habituated in marching in other people's countries, and of course having to quell revolts that were a bit the standards among these populations. Secondly, because of the great conflicts that arose among the Longobard dukes themselves, the sense of Longobardness was felt in sort of a different way. Each one of these duchies had some interest on its own, right? It's at this point that when the Franks have taken over the majority of the country, that of course, even as a smaller duchy that historically is not predisposed to be, just a military machine, because the situation is really noble, right? You have at best your own local city forces, the ones of the nobility leading them, but you could at best make mass against the Carolingians, but those are the ones who, again, every single damn year make war, all organized, all together, with massive resources coming from entire Europe. So it's a bit worrying, to say the least. There was a problem regarding who should have been the leader of this revolt. In fact, some Longobard dukes wanted to place back on the Longobard throne had the Pope Vale successfully rebelled against the Franks. Adelchis, that is Desiderius' son, which actually outraged the Veneto-Friulan faction that would have at that point felt offended. They believed that the Adelchis father's deeds were enough to basically oust that house from the kingdom in the first place. So you have this antagonism, essentially, and in general external machinations, making such widespread uprising fail. However, the Austrians decided to rebel by themselves. They decided, essentially, if we can't mobilize the entire country, let's just show them what we're made of, right? This would have basically equated to defend the Veneto, like we're talking about Veneto in general, like the region did not exist at the time as such, more or less right overlapping the contemporary area, demonstrating essentially how it would have been possible for this irreducible defenders of Longobard independence, what really meant to be a Longobard, in fact, and how their rule was the one sword in hand, right, or pair with the Franks, and showing who was better, right? And the rebellion did actually break out, right? They had the guts of doing this. Evidently, they had a sense they could succeed, and definitely there was nothing to kid about that from the Frankish side. Charlemagne was informed of the rebellion in the autumn of 775. So in the worst moment, that is to say, you have to wait all winter before intervening. He was, in fact, on his way back to France after having been involved, by the way, that year in one of the military expeditions in the long war against the Saxons, right, that had began in 772, and the first years were really investing without much comeback, right? But the Franks were not quitters, and that they had started the subjugation of Saxony with that ferocity, exactly because they knew that it was the only way to cope with that. Charlemagne at that point would have normally, say, every year would come back to France normally. Right. Instead, he decided, because of the Veneto-Friulan rebellion, to spend the winter at the Alpine foothills in Germany, and as soon as possible to cross the mountains into Italy to arrive in the northeast in the month of March of 776. This was quite important because normally the Franks in Central Europe mobilized in May, right? The field of May was normally the moment of gathering of the Carolingian forces as well as political testing. In Southern Europe, they started war in March. So Charlemagne evidently wanted to prevent the rebellion that, also having broken out in autumn, could not, let's say, take on the strategic offensive that that quickly during winter as well. So to cripple it right immediately at the beginning of the season. This tells you with which haste the Frankish king coped with this. He had to hurry, rather, to a point of betting a lot on the possibility of crushing these rebels before the uprising would engulf a wider area, and still coming back to his occupation of hammering the Saxons or crushing other rebels around the empire. So the rebellion was also a sort of come here and try to tame us kind of strategy, right? Because the Longobard rebels did not have, by this point, even just if they had wanted to move further with it, like a chance to, let's say, to cope with the Carolingian forces in some other land that was not their own. So even invading Neustria, for example, would have not necessarily been a good idea. They had, of course, politically and strategically proved that they could defeat Charlemagne in battle. Right, this is the level of hype that these guys had, and the sense of themselves, and the faith in their military capacity, and in the general values of their own people. Rothkausus was the commander of the Longobard rebels that, of course, met Charlemagne and his army in arms themselves. Rothkausus was sided by his father-in-law Stabilinius, that was Duke of Treviso, and Gaidus, that was the Duke of Vicenza. So it was a compact front of people that, as we've seen, essentially knew each other, were neighbors, relatives, and had a decent esprit de corps, right, to mount up a rebellion against the greatest force in Europe. So it's really impressive if you look at it in perspective. Now that's where the Battle of the Livenza River took place, right? We do not know exactly where. As we'll see now, we have a couple of hypotheses. This river crosses, for a good trade of its course, today's provinces of Treviso and Pordenone. But there are different rivers, it can't form barriers. I mean, this is nothing that can stop an army, whichever one was involved here. But still, it was, of course, a bulwark, right, to defend strategically, but also tactically. Even though we do not know much about the battle itself, how it was practically fought, right? We think, however, that the clash occurred in the territory of today's city of Motta di Livenza. This would have occurred if Charlemagne had marched through the ancient Postumian road, right, that crossed the Po Valley west to east. Otherwise, the site of the battle could be at a bridge that Paul the Deacon, in his Historia Longobardorum, remembers as a sort of obliged step, albeit in the story, for the last years of the 7th century, for whom from Friuli, of which the Saint Paul was native, had to go to Pavia, so the Longobard capital, and located next to a forest known as Capulanus, distant, quote, quadraginta e octo millibus from Cividale, the capital of the Friulan Duchy. So this place would lay on the path to the heart of the of the Longobard rebel power, that would make a lot of sense for Charlemagne, right? This road basically crosses longitudinally the Friulan plain, right, through important centers such as Codroy, Pordenone, Sacile, and it went down as far as the same Postumian road that in fact led to Verona and other important cities of Longobard Austria, right? So it would make a lot of sense. Perhaps you may think there was even some ambush attempt or something like that. We unfortunately haven't the palest idea what happened tactically in this engagement, right? We could just speculate on it. Of course, the Longobards would have waited for the Carolingians in a defensive position, so behind the Livenza River, and they may have attempted some trick, right? Again, ambushes, flank attacks, maybe from the force, something like that, trying to halt the charges of the Carolingians, maybe on the same bridge, or maybe it was some other crossing. We don't know at this point. However, what strikes you about this battle is what the sources tell about the outcome, right? And this is really fascinating because this battle, for in other countries, would have probably also historiographically been recorded more strongly, right? But let's say in the 19th century, Italian nationalism wasn't looking at the Longobards in the proper historical objective way, and so just recently scholars began to reevaluate this event because it tells a lot about the importance that, first of all, Italy had for the empire and the sense of freedom. The Longobards, now as Italians, basically were fighting for against this foreign invasion. So the Frankish sources tell of the death of Rothgauzes, that in fact, as far as we know, did perish in the battle, right? And this, as a general indicator, definitely doesn't, aside from the actual statement that the Longobards were defeated in the Frankish sources, is obviously pointing at major losses among the Longobards, because if their leader dies in battle, normally the elite stayed in reserve. They would fight to the last man or things like that. So if the commander dies, well, we don't know, right? Maybe he, as we will see now, that the outcome may have been different. But it did happen on some occasions that the same commander was killed even when his army was victorious. In any case, the Frankish sources go on and say that not just the Longobards were crushed, but that Charlemagne reconquered all the rebel cities of Austria, and that he celebrated Easter in the same Treviso. That was, as we've seen, one of the major seats of the rebels. And by the way, all this after having imposed some Frankish counts in place of the Longobard dukes as local governors. Right, so here it's a defeat without appeal, or at least one of the many Carolingian victories over a rebellious people that in these sources is also not recounted with enormous detail in the first place. But we have another source, right? This one is a Longobard one. We're talking about Andrew from Bergamo, a Lombard city. This guy was a monk and a historian, like most of these authors in the first place. He was a Longobard himself. Well, in Bergamo, everybody would be but technically in the now in the Italic kingdom, yet the wide majority of the population were Longobards. Then there were those areas of the Exarchate where the people had remained Roman historically until they had been conquered by Longobards, and who had granted them the possibility of keeping to exercise their juridical identity, right? Also, like according to Longobard law, if two Longobards wanted to make a contract in Roman terms, they could, as long as it was consensual, naturally. There were now also the Franks, interestingly enough. You had other interesting, I don't know, in Rome there were the various scholae of the Saxons, of the Longobards, of the Franks themselves. So here Andrew is definitely a true Longobard in the conventional sense. He lived at the times of Louis II, known as the Younger, Roman Emperor and King of Italy. This was the great-grandson of Charlemagne. He was the son of Lothair I. So we are between 824 and 875, which is even a positive period. I mean, the center of the empire is the Longobard kingdom at this point. The general system works, right? There is a gradual contraction towards the end of the period because the Carolingian Empire was falling apart in the first place. But say it's not a context where you find acrimony or general sense of hatred towards the Franks. In fact, Andrew is a pretty reliable scholar. And it is exactly for this reason that what he says stands out, because he literally gives a diametrically opposite account of what happened. Right? Andrew was the author of a modest continuation of the more famous Historia Langobardorum of Paul the Deacon. Andrew based himself on surely some oral account. He was a Longobard. This battle. He lived in Bergamo. It is still pretty close to Longobard, Austria, after all. Right, some tens of kilometers. He knew surely what had happened. These events that occurred just a couple of generations before, and he states that on the Livenza River, the Longobards defeated Charlemagne, to the point that the king was even obliged to accept a compromise, that is to say, in exchange of an oath of fealty to the Frankish monarch from the side of the Veneto-Friuland noblemen, the latter were confirmed in their respective office and obtained the recognition of their power on the ducal territories. Now, this is heavy stuff, right? Because, as we said, first of all, Andrew is reliable. Generally speaking, again, I will not start my rant against the anti-narrative source bias, but, the Frankish sources, in fact, are of the same print, right? So you can say, of course, this guy's a Longobard, those were Franks, and of course they say respectively that their guy won, right? In a way or another. Here, Rutcausus died, there's no doubt about this, and the majority of scholars that are aware, of course, of the battle on the Livenza tend to recognize that the Frankish sources are more acceptable, right? That Charlemagne did defeat the Longobards, and surely there may have been an arrangement like the one that Andrew talks about. But the question is, we do not know better than these sources, meaning that somebody here is lying, right, or at least has interpreted the thing their own way, right? Surely Andrew is a Longobard, but he's also living in a Carolingian situation in which nothing really negative is occurring. He's objective and reliable considering the events of the time, and it literally states that these guys had won. And it just goes like that without much of a problem. You see, I did research in my time something about battles, right? That's literally what I do for a living. And still, I remember clearly a battle of the early 14th century, which we have an account that tells us, multiple accounts that tells us what happened in that battle. That was surely hardly fought. And we have the main sources, narrative ones, telling us, that the side won. Then we have an informer to a king, by the way, in another country that says, look, those other guys won. And there you literally do not have a historical way to ascertain, other than, of course, the historical critique, right, to the reliability of the sources, what actually happened. Right, in that case, the battle was actually won by the side that the narrative sources said. But sometimes these clashes are so, again, isolated. And here we're talking, in the general context, right, of the of analytics of how these events would follow and how the narrative actually just passes from one another, that you do not have sometimes like just the certainty that everything went, of course, the way it does. And obviously when you find multiple sources talking about the same event, you realize how, of course, they change something, at least in the way they say the thing. And generally speaking, however, they are coherent with one another. So is there a way to reconcile these accounts? Well, there may be, right? For a simple reason, right? The fact that Rotcausus died, for example. The fact that Charlemagne had to rush to that place and had literally to attack the Longobards that had time to prepare tells us that this battle was definitely hardly fought. That this wasn't like just at the locks, like the Longobards giving way because they had been outflanked and simply broken and fled. Here we are in the presence of, in my opinion, a Frankish victory that, however, was so costly, that brought, like for the times and places, that brought Charlemagne to essentially grant to at least those who had made it to probably to flee after the battle and to entrench themselves as usual in their fortified centers. Notice that here Charlemagne spends the Easter in Treviso, but there are other cities around that we're not just precisely informed on altogether, that may have simply received there the fealty of the Austrian Longobards, but in exchange for large autonomies, because literally he understood that these guys had been fighting and dying for their own liberty, and that if he had put them further to the corner and humiliated them, further revolts would have broken out. So that for Andrew to write that this had been a Longobard victory, well, there is some Clausewitzian consideration. War is just the continuation of politics with other means, and if the objective was to at least gamble, as warfare obliges you to do as a political choice, and the outcome of this battle had been such that the Longobards at this point could locally obtain some large autonomy, not to be brought under as others, or at least remaining, say, cut off, dispossessed from their homes, from their holdings. This may have instead succeeded in not happening. Admittedly, the Frankish sources says that Charlemagne installs Frankish counts locally, which may have actually happened, and surely there was some head, jumping, let's put it this way. But the general sense of the local spirit of resistance may have definitely brought to a compromise. It would be rare, This was a relatively peripheral area, Charlemagne understood that was probably not even worth fighting there just per se. Once you control Lombardy and Tuscany, you could easily go to Rome, crossing the Alps, mostly from France, so in the northwest. what was the point of humiliating further this northeastern Longobards that were, even in that situation, fundamentally continuing just that work of defense of the eastern borders from the Slavs or the others, and that could have just as local nobility being co-opted, right? Even with field to the king. So something that it still entailed a military reserve. We know that the Longobards provided the Carolingian army with actually picked bodies of troops with elite forces that were apparently quite appreciated, because again, these Longobards, as we've seen, hadn't developed the same say national-wide military machine based on a hardcore professional troops that with an imposing logistical system. Again, the Longobard kingdom was as large as some of the chunks of the Franks ruled over, like also north of the Alps. There was no match in practice. But that were spirited as far as this ducal households. Think about the Gazindi or other, whatever you wanna call them, in a sort of elite kind of retinue that could also afford at that point, especially with the general impoverishment also of the rest of the population, ever more resources, right? Consider that, of course, with the Frankish conquest, there had been a lot of, as we've seen, shattering of local society. So even those dukes that could remain in charge had now greater power in relative terms towards the population. It would just, generally speaking, also marry to the Carolingian, say, Frankish nobility that had been installed there. Mostly, that's the origin of the later times Italic aristocracy. Because many Longobards remained actually in charge, right? And the same Franks at a point became Longobards locally, right? To some degrees, right? So aside from always the important Transalpine connections that existed throughout, as we've seen also in other videos, during the 10th, the 11th century and beyond. So this battle is, we think, destined to remain a mystery. There is no way somebody comes up with, oh my god, I discovered a new source, right, that talks, by the way, specifically about this. This is not how it really worked. If this battle definitely happened. It wasn't a major one, but it's also not just an irrelevant one, even by size probably. This is an entire province essentially picking up arms. It's serious enough. Again, if the Franks had, even at least Charlemagne was not crushed or say defeated in a military sense in this, otherwise probably they would have, the Longobard, that would have been a big thing, right? The Longobards were surely at that point rising up in larger numbers. Probably the Icas would have been too large, right? It would have been documented extensively about the consequences and so on, and so the same battle would have been highlighted by the sources. Right? But always remember, this is the end of the 8th century. We have painstakingly low amount of information about general warfare and even single events. At some point, this is said as it sounds, but these information, these voices, especially from, in this case, again, a Longobard, somebody that was a bit more, say, civilized, literate, just exposed to a more thriving world, also socioeconomically, that had an eye. You could state this, and somebody could say, well, yeah, that's how it basically happened, right? And that's how we record the event, and we can agree to some level that this was the case. It can be a thing. Paul the Diacon's brother, Arachis, was captured in the battle, This is yet another anecdote. Paul the Deacon may have been part himself of the plot against Charlemagne, and he was eventually, as you know, like a courtier north of the Alps. He also, he retired in Monte Cassino at the point he wrote to the same emperor that he knew personally to free from prison his brother, which Charlemagne did. So this tells you the level also of international connection that the Austrian Longobard aristocracy really had in the empire. Right here and there, we've seen how again this region continues, but the aforementioned role of these are the lands from which the Franks would invade the Slavs, like the Croats, the even further beyond that. The Longobards participated again to expeditions against the Avars with the Carolingian army and all the stuff. So it's a much more it's a lot of stuff, right, all together, and very often we can't see clearly through it, but we know that the thing happened. Also about the forces involved, we do not know much. As I said at the beginning, there is really no difference between the Longobards and the Franks by the 8th century. In terms of material culture, they're pretty much the same. There is no reason to think otherwise. There was some variety in the same equipment, but the essentials were the same, right? From the laws of recruitment of Aistulf that I talked about in the video about the organization of the Longobard army, we know that this was the standard Romano-Germanic recruitment system. It was identical in the Carolingian Empire, except that was differently balanced, again, in a political and social point of view. So the classes of recruitment would be, thinner, fatter, depending on whether you are in Langobardia or in Francia, let's put it this way. On February the 20th, 776, that is to say on the eve of the very expedition against the Veneto-Friulan rebellion, Charlemagne issued a capitulary that was specifically destined, like we are in Italy, this is an italic law, destined to essentially alleviate the harsh conditions of the kingdom inhabitants in general, like the commoners in practice that had surely been suffering in the previous years of the Frankish Longobard War, that, as we've seen, had been just overwhelmed by the conquest that had created instability. Surely some places had been raided, ravaged by the Franks that had also just sustained their expedition further with the local resources. Now were dictating law, had been changing a substantial amount of things. And this makes it clear that it was a provision destined to undermine the Longobard nobility at that point, or at least an attempt, right? The idea was easing the condition of the people so to make them more sympathetic to the Frankish cause than the one of the Longobard rebels, right? So the clash would have occurred within a month or a little more, but the capacity of saying, look, just even before we go fight against them, remember that we actually care about the local population. Don't think that those guys rebelling are going to make your goods. We are the masters now. We proved it on the battlefield. Just remember that. But say for now, we will ease your conditions a bit as long as you do not join those guys. Right? That's the general meaning of that specific capitulary. Right. After this revolt, by the way, it is true that Carolingians managed to substitute a substantial amount of Longobard dukes with Frankish counts. Right. We're not talking just about vassals, like secular vassals, but also bishops. Right. So some had naturally fallen in battle. Some had been captured, as we've seen. So there was some point that in which the Franks would not be compromising with the situation, but others in which they had to stop and say, okay, well, we must take care about the situation, because our rebellion in Italy could cause major problems for the broader system, as it was proven by the way Charlemagne unusually rushed to Italy as quickly as possible to quell the rebellion, right? Even Italy succeeding, by the way, so independently from how that battle was fought. But that battle was a mean to an end, and it's still unclear from the details, right? What kind of condition, just like the Austrian nobility could simply get from that point onwards. So it's now useless to stress all the political and strategic implications of this rebellion, because it was the true Longobard last stand, right? If we make the exception of the Langobardia minor, or at least the Duchy of Benevent, and so where many northern Longobards took refuge, right? The same Paul the Deacon went there. There was an ancestral connection between the Friulan and the Beneventan dukes. At some point, Grimoald, for example, was a Beneventan duke and king of the Longobards, was actually originally Friulan. Reason for which Paul the Deacon tells us in greater depth about Beneventan history than, say, the Neustrian one, right? This tells you how relatively distant, right, the northeastern Longobards were from Pavia, but let's not exaggerate it either, right? So this sense of mobilizing the forces of this cities, right? The dukes of Friuli, of Treviso, of Vicenza, it's a substantial force, and it surely does create a problem in the Po Valley if left unchecked, right? This battle has not been, of course, considered, particularly from a historiographical point of view. As we were telling before, it remains, of course, a secondary clash in the broader order of things, right? Or at least there were so many Carolingian battles that this one doesn't shine more or less than others. But it's true that it's been somehow overlooked. And there is, of course, a meaning that has to do with the general resistance that the Carolingians met, right, during their conquest campaigns among within the subjugated peoples after they had been crushed, right? You can, in a sense, criticize the lack of compactness of the Longobards in the face of the Frankish onslaught in the first place. Why hadn't these guys fought with Desiderius, in spite of the fact that they didn't? But it was important to them, the fact that he was not his king, their king, right? That somebody else had placed him there. And so this is something worth, as in the example of Rodcaudus, to actually still take the field. It's not cowardice, even, because otherwise they would have not even fought, or maybe they realized it was worse than they had imagined, right, under the Carolingians. In any case, they knew how to fight and die, but also probably to obtain something out of this sacrifice, right? And this speaks in general of the value of an area of the Longobard realm that surely had remained more faithful to traditional ways, and that decided to prove it in such a fashion. So even though we cannot focus precisely on that day of March in this faraway 776, then it's that old, right? It's exactly 300 years later that the position of Romulus Augustus by Odoacer, right? So it's just that close, right? Remember, this is 1300 years ago, and only 300 years before that was reality, right? So it's a world that you have to make sense of also in the mental categories, right? There is this tendency when we think of the Middle Ages of projecting it all towards, say, further ahead, because we've been told that the Roman world ended, and so whatever happened later is the Middle Ages, and so it goes on, and you don't look back. But in 776, you do not have the Middle Ages, you do not have all that happened later, you have what happened before. And these people knew it, naturally, to some degree, even better than we do. Especially in as much as the Longobard conquest had been crowned now by the full integration and the full unification, like, of the Longobards with the Romans, right? These people now were all Longobards by name, but they spoke Romance, and they were Catholic, but they still believed surely in the, like, it emerges beautifully from the same history of Paul the Deacon, like the older national deeds of the Longobards, the pagan past, what he calls ridicola fabula, so a silly fairy tale, but that he actually writes about, because as a clergyman he couldn't quite simply say, well, okay, well, it's normal to talk about Woden in my in my story, or about Ulfednar or something like that, but they knew it was a thing. And even though, again, even in the northeast of Italy, the Longobards by now were significantly civilized and gentrified, they evidently still knew how to pass these wars when needed, and immolate themselves for a cause that they evidently thought was greater than us. So we can unfortunately think of this episode just imagining, like, the echoes of the the neighing of the horses, the swords clashing against one another, the shouts, the war cries, the lamentations of the wounded, the desolation of this. Just think about what it could be Europe like in the 8th century, right? The blood in this river, the general nature, the sky. Have you ever thought what was the sky like, at the time? What the atmosphere, how pure the air really was, even though, yes, of course, in some places was significantly polluted, even at the time, because of the smokes or whatever, but in a battle in open field, with a mindset that still tells you that, and the Carolingians too knew it perfectly well, that if you fight for the holy cause, you will maybe achieve a transcendental status and, fly in heaven, right, as a warrior, as a divine achiever, fundamentally. So this vision, right, was shared in common by the Franks and the Longobards. They were shared in this space that, again, was bearing Germanic names, banners, symbols, but all around him, as we've seen, Roman roads, cities, bridges, things like that, in a world that is the one that would mold what we are now. This is never to be forgotten, as long as you accurately reconstruct these events, right? And you reflect on the broader implications and what you could you could learn from them, right? What is the value of liberty, for example, in the 8th century? What is for us today? And again, I plan to keep on talking about the Longobards, but I thought this battle was fascinating because definitely there are others to discuss, but it's a bit of a secondary one. It's somehow legendary. There is this kind of plot twist, at least from Andrew of Bergamo, that says that actually this might have been a battle in which the Carolingians may have been defeated, may have been bled white, which is an actual possibility, surely the Longobards achieving that at a high price anyway. But still, right? Having had someone realizing that this had been important, right? Writing it down, remembering it, and giving meaning to it in a way or another for what war practically means, right? So to compel the enemy to fulfill one's will, and naturally the outcome is never limpid, right? There is no such thing like absolute war, as von Clausewitz teaches us, and so we have to appreciate always the that political background, and at least understanding what is that these people thought, right, and why they went at war like that, being killed like root causes and so on, right? So this was it. I again will keep talking hopefully about the Longobards soon. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.